I'm Ron Thiemann from Harvard Divinity School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in the Religion and Society Doctoral Colloquium on theorizing race and ethnicity in religious studies and theology. We are delighted to welcome as this evening's lecturer, Professor Eddie Glaude. Professor Glaude is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University and is a core faculty member in the Center for African American Studies. He is also the founding member and senior fellow of the Jamestown Project, based here in Cambridge, which is an initiative that provides a forum for everyday citizens to engage in democratic deliberation on issues of race, ethnicity, and gender. Professor Glaude's first book, Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, won the Modern Language Association William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize in 2000. He has also edited Is It Nation Time? Contemporary Essays on Black Power and Black Nationalism, published in 2002, and in 2003 collaborated with Cornel West in editing African American Religious Studies, an anthology. His most recent book, In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, published in 2007, is an important and critical engagement with the philosophical thought of John Dewey, making the case that pragmatism remains a live and viable option for thinking about African American politics in the 21st century. Most fascinating about this work is that it ends by advocating for what Glaude has called a post-soul politics, the working title for his next book, which is a form of political engagement that acknowledges the legacy of Black freedom struggles of the 60s, but ultimately moves beyond that legacy in an effort to rise to the new challenges facing America's commitment to values in participatory democracy. Tonight, with the overall arching theme of this lecture series, his lecture is entitled The African in African American Religion. Professor Eddie Glaude.
That was just the truth.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you this evening with so many friends. Professor Gregory from my hometown, not really hometown, but from my institution, to see the great Charles Adams here. It's just amazing. It's an honor to be here with you. I want to thank Dr. Thiemann, my dear brother Ron, and brother Terrence for making this moment possible. I have a close friend from Morehouse who's here, Professor Ron Sullivan from Harvard Law School. We went to Morehouse together. We're getting old together. Right. And I see several of my former students, Danielle from Amherst and Ernie from Princeton, and it's a delight to be here. And hopefully I'll have something to say that's of substance. Let me jump right into it. The title, I adjusted the title a bit. Sister Marla and Sister Evelyn, thank you for coming. Jock Reeder, Dean, everybody. I shouldn't have, once you start listing, you get in trouble, don't you? It's one of the sins of this thing. Dean Graham, thank you. Let's just jump into it. I changed the title a bit. It's Africa in the Study of African American Religion. And this is really part of a broader set of reflections. I'm obsessing at this particular moment with Du Bois's reflections on African American religion. And this is just another kind of vignette piece, kind of thinking about what he opens up and what he shuts down. And in this case, I want to talk about how Africa figures in the study of African American religion. Studying religion is a perilous endeavor. We need only think about the inherent ambiguity in the field's central term of art, religion, and reflect on the multiplicity of traditions and practices that complicate what can be said about religions to get a sense that the subject matter is fraught with difficulties. Those of us who study religion often find ourselves in what Samuel Beckett called the mess. The messiness of faiths, beliefs, doctrines, rituals of modern prejudices, and of the practices of a scholarly guild with its own standards of excellence and failure. Like Beckett, our task as scholars has been and continues to be to find some way to accommodate this mess, that is, in part, our own doing. And many of us, at least some of us, I think, recognize, even as we stumble about, that much is at stake. An informative body of literature has been written about the difficulties in the study of religion. I don't need to go into that. My aim in this talk tonight is not to take up the particulars of those debates. I do hold the view, however, that many of the concerns evidenced in these conversations are interestingly complicated when the term religion is overdetermined by the adjective black or African American. I hold this view because the adjectives bear the unusual burden of an enormously complicated history that colors the way religion is practiced and understood. Indeed, on their own, both terms generate enormous debate. Distinctions between being religious and doing religion, or concerns about whether races are real or not, animate conversations throughout the academy. But what happens when we think about them in tandem? What do we mean when we describe certain African American practices as religious practices? And what work is the adjective doing here? How do our answers to these questions inform our histories of African American religion? Now, I don't know why I brought it up, but I won't be able to take up these rather broad questions in the context of this talk, but I brought them up anyway. But they frame how I examine the vexed issue of the place of Africa in the study of African American religion. Indeed, uses of the trope of Africa in many accounts of African American religion help us understand the potential meanings that follow from thinking about the terms together, particularly in the manner in which the trope registers histories of violence and displacement that capture the distinctive entree of African Americans into the modern world. Indeed, the distinctiveness of African American religion is often located in its African origins, a place that simultaneously marks a condition of living prior to the fateful encounters with white Europeans, and one tragically disrupted by them as well. This disruption, in some ways, necessitates, at least for some of us, a narrative insistence on the centrality of Africa and its place in the beliefs, choices, and actions of the continent's descendants. Africa, and in some instances its diaspora, stand then as a principle of narrative and historical uncertainty, the site of an imaginary order disrupted by profane history that speaks of a destiny resulting from that disruption. In this sense, constructions of African American religion that take seriously questions of African origins and dispersion accentuate issues of black agency, resistance, and freedom precisely because those constructions take shape amid the destruction and ruin that followed Europe's encounter with Africa. Robert Orsi, can I mention his name here? Robert Orsi has it right. I'm being naughty. Robert Orsi has it right when he says that, quote, the history of the study of religion is always a political history, just as the political and intellectual history of modernity is always a religious history, end quote. The history of African American religion is no different. It is always a political history of sorts, distinctly signifying on discourses about religions and religion in the West. And of course, the trope of Africa is one of its central tools. Uses of Africa in the histories of African American religion do a certain kind of work in what I want to call narratives of recovery, redemption, and resistance. We can talk about that later. These kinds of stories announce that the lives of Africa's children do not begin with the transatlantic slave trade, that these individuals exhibit in their daily lives the presence of Africa in their worldviews, in their conceptions of life and death, and in the moral and ethical principles that guide them as they negotiate their circumstances. Within these narratives, black agency is central because the very presence of African Americans acting on their own behalf betrays the lie that white supremacy has reduced them to mere pawns in the doings of white men. Of course, the fact of African-descended peoples acting for themselves, taking on this significance as opposed to some other, involves a kind of poetic troping of the facts, which gives them the quality of heroic self-assertion, a sense of commonly shared experience, and a singularity of reference and meaning that come to signify the essence of a people engaged in struggle. Now, such stories are not necessarily bad. The violence of America, physical and epistemic, easily warrants such a narrative technique that emphasizes the, quote, unifying experiences of African peoples dispersed by the slave trade, as well as efforts to locate a single culture within singular historical roots, or single culture with singular historical roots, as a basis for emboldening those persons to resist their subjugation, end quote. So what I just said was, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we tell a story about these folk who caught hell because of the slave trade. And then when we tell a story about them being located in one particular place, that location in one singular culture provides them with singular historical roots, which gives those dispersed people the resources to imagine themselves as agents in the world. That's not a bad thing at all. Moreover, in light of the grand narratives of American religion and history that all too often marginalize the presence of African Americans, such narratives constitute important interventions and corrections. They reveal the bodies buried beneath the pristine histories of the American nation state. But we need to understand these stories as constructions that attempt to do a certain kind of work, not simply as the account of the origins of African American religion. They are indeed other ways of beginning the story. There are other ways of beginning the story. Now, of course, a distinction is to be made between origins and beginnings. Beginnings constitute a first step in the production of meanings about a given topic, as well as a means of differentiating between competing views. I begin this way as opposed to that. Origins, some would believe, are not subject to such choice. They reflect the fact of the matter. We cannot begin the story otherwise. My aim here is to recast this concern about origins in light of the overall question of narrative. What are the implications of beginning the story in this way and holding the view that this beginning, as opposed to another, constitutes the beginning of the story of African American religion? Why do we have to begin with Africa? Right, as a way of marking the distinctive agency of African American practitioners of religion. Edward Said writes of beginnings. Can I quote Said here? Sure. A beginning suggests either A, a time, B, a place, C, an object, D, a principle, or E, an act. In short, detachment of the sort that establishes distance between either time, place, an object, principle, or an act on the one hand, or what came before it on the other. Said goes on to write, my beginning, specializes still more, but the moment I unconditionally speak of the beginning, knowledge is theologized. Knowledge is theologized. Once made the focus of attention, Said goes on to say, once made the focus of attention, the beginning occupies the foreground and is no longer a beginning, but has the status of an actuality. And when it cedes its place to that which it has aimed to produce or to give rise to it, it can exist in the mind as virtuality. Paraphrasing Said says, both Hegel and Vico, we can say, and I think this is really important, that formally the problem of beginning is the beginning of the problem. The problem of beginning is the beginning of the problem. Stories of African American religion that posit Africa as the beginning generate particular problems that need to be made explicit. Not so much because knowledge is theologized. Said is justifiably skeptical of the processes by which historical claims are mapped onto the very order of things, an order that stands apart from the actual doings and sufferings of people. I take it that his characterization of such processes as the theologizing of knowledge is consistent with his thoroughgoing secularism. One need not embrace, however, his overall suspicion of religion to take seriously his insights about the problem of how to begin to grasp the relationship between the past and the circumstances and exigencies of the present. We can in fact begin to do some of the work of making these problems explicit by isolating particular dimensions of the narrative of African American religion such a beginning has produced. We should be mindful when we write or invoke history, and I say this to those of you who know this already, but we should be mindful when we write or invoke history as historians, philosophers, or as cultural critics, that we are not engaged in a dispassionate detailing of facts or a mere representation of the record. Rather, we actively work in shaping the narrative, in singling out certain events and particular characters, and we do so with purposes and interests in mind. In writing such histories, we find ourselves negotiating the authority of tradition, the constraining power of conventions, and encountering the limits of narrative form. History, then, is always written, even when not explicitly acknowledged to be so, from a self-consciously critical point of view, and in full awareness of the temporal distance between the historian and the subject or subjects about which she writes. I like Thomas Tweed's kind of characterization of this process when he writes, "The stories that fill history textbooks are important because they negotiate power and construct identity. They situate us in society and tell us who we are. Historical narratives often reflect and shape the social and economic order. Individuals and groups excluded from narratives are excluded from more than stories. Those who do not find themselves or their experiences represented in the most widely told stories engage in struggle, private and public, quiet and noisy, to make sense of themselves and locate their place among others in the wider society." Historical narratives, then, Tweed writes, never are just history, right? There always is a great deal at stake for narrators and readers, always much to gain and lose in power and meaning, end quote. For a subject people, for folk catching hell, this insight takes on added significance. Can I say for folk catching hell here? I've been moving, just as a quick aside, I've been moving between different spaces. You know, I just did a radio show in Mississippi, in Macomb, Mississippi. And now I'm here at Harvard. It's been a journey. So I'm trying to keep these worlds in place. Now, but Tweed's insight takes on added significance for folk who are oppressed, who are catching hell. Their subjugation not only involves their actual bodies, but also the colonization of history, capital H, and the forging of a regime of truth that often regulates them beyond the margins. Remember that paraphrase from Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. By a perversion, the colonizer is not content with just simply colonizing the subject, but to go into the history of the colonized and to wipe it clean. So history, capital H, becomes a crucial site of struggle. This account not only removes the slave, for example, from history at capital H, but denies her moral standing as a result. As such, history becomes a critical battleground, often resulting in a theologized history upon which issues of meaning, identity, and resistance are addressed. And for black folk, I want to maintain, Africa stands as a crucial site of contestation in this battle. In his 1998 book, Afrotopia, Wilson Moses extraordinary intellectual historian, delineates popular traditions of African American historiography that reflect this political and existential reality. Both the historiography of decline, that is a historical narrative that begins with the greatness of an African past that has been displaced by the brutality of the West, and the historiography of progress, a story that posits a progressive evolution toward improved conditions for African Americans, engage, according to Moses, in a battle around meaning and identity. Both historical accounts take up the importance of Africa as a site for regeneration and recovery of meanings lost in the face of the brutality of white supremacy. Both stand as different examples of a kind of vindicationism, or what he says, quote, the project of defending black people from the charge that they have made little or no contribution to the history of human progress, end quote. What is interesting about Moses' account, for my purposes tonight, is the extent to which he captures a general tendency in African American religious historiography, how we account for the African presence in African American religion, how we understand its power in the religious imagination of African Americans, its influence on the form and content of black religious expression, and its centrality to a conception of black identity forged in the struggle for freedom in the New World. Now, I think Du Bois is at the heart of this. And so this section is called Du Bois, A Beginning of Sorts. W.E.B. Du Bois's classic text, The Souls of Black Folk, and particularly his chapter of the Faith of Our Fathers, inaugurates these sorts of concerns in the formal writing of African American religious history. I read of the Faith of Our Fathers as one of the first treatments of African American religion as an object of inquiry. Right? He's not engaged in the explication of a faith tradition. He's not engaged in writing church history. In fact, he's treating African American religion as an object of sociological inquiry, as an object of historical investigation. Du Bois does not take himself, as I said, to be explicating the faith claims of a particular religious denomination. Rather, he sets out to examine the social history of the quote-unquote black church and its then current role in African American life. As such, many of the concerns that preoccupy, I believe, contemporary studies of African American religion can be found in Du Bois's account. I don't want to make the genetic fallacy here, right, by trying to link all of the current stuff to Du Bois's failings, but I think Du Bois, in interesting sorts of ways, sets the frame for how much of African American religious studies or religious history is written. Now, three important tendencies stand out. First, Du Bois foregrounds the social function of black churches and draws on the distinction between otherworldly and this worldly religion, between accommodation and protest. Those of you who are studying African American religion, you know those categories. That binary just is an obsession of those of us who study African American religion. So this distinction between otherworldly and this worldly religion that has defined so much of the literature on the subject, the emphasis on black churches also reveals in some interesting sort of way the decidedly Christian bias in much of the work done on African American religion. Second, Du Bois refuses to ghettoize his account of African American religion, right? He understands it within the larger context of American religious history, right? Prefiguring Sidney Alstrom's claim that the recovery of African American religion serves as a paradigm for the recovery of American religious history generally, right? Du Bois's account of African American religion functions, I believe, in the context of Souls as a synecdochic account, where to tell the story of African American religion is to tell in part the story of American religion, right? Lastly, Du Bois attempts to account for the place of Africa in the history of African American religion. In fact, he answers the question, what have been the successive steps of this social history? Remember that question in Souls? If you don't, just nod your head. What have been the successive steps of this social history? With the claim, he answers that question with the claim that the foundations of African American religion are found not in America, but in Africa. Du Bois writes, quote, "First, we must realize that no such institution as the Negro Church could rear itself without definite historical foundations. These foundations we can find if we remember that the social history of the Negro did not start in America. He was brought from a definite social environment, the polygamous clan life under the headship of the chief and the potent influence of the priest. His religion was nature worship, with profound belief in invisible surrounding influences, good and bad, and his worship was through incantation and sacrifice, end quote. Now, drawing on the bad anthropological descriptions of Africa that circulated at the time, Du Bois offers a description of a form of life that in fact informed how African-descended peoples negotiated the devastating implications of New World slavery. He describes the violent disruption of forms of life and claims that although it was a horrific social revolution, quote, some traces were retained of the former group life, and the chief remaining institution, as you recall, was the priest or the medicine man, right? And then he makes a correlation between the priest, medicine man, and the preacher, right? And the preacher, of course, is part of this threefold characterization of the black church: the preacher, the music, and the frenzy, right? So I'm not interested in I'm not interested in a lot today. I'm not interested in vindicating Du Bois's claim about the continuity between the medicine man and the black preacher. What interests me instead is that his move to Africa as foundation must be understood within the context of writing history, small h, against history, capital H, a form of writing bound up with the struggle against white supremacy. To highlight the trope of African beginnings in the construction of his story, then, is to read Du Bois's use of the trope as part of a discursive battle to redeem African Americans. And given that I'm figuring his study as paradigmatic for African American religious history, his beginning sets the trajectory of how the story has been told ever since, I believe. Now, one can see this way of beginning the narrative in the extraordinary ferment of the 1960s and 70s, when so many of our now classic texts in the field were written. These histories sought to recover and redeem a past long neglected in mainstream American religious history. Albert Rabbitoe, whom I love dearly, reflecting on the time, writes, quote, "For many of us studying in those movement years, the attempt to research and write about African American history had a personal significance and a political impetus. I felt that in my recovery of this history lay the restoration of my past, myself, and my people. In this context, I chose to write about the history of the religious life of slaves." End quote. Now, I think this view captures much of the moment, particularly the sorts of debates about slave agency and religious commitments. Many wrestled with the question of what, if anything, was distinctive about slave culture, end quote. The question of distinctiveness was answered by many, not necessarily Professor Rabbitoe, but by many with appeals to African survivals, right? Slave religion was not merely a replication of the master's religion. Slaves were not reduced to sambos by the peculiar institution. Rather, they had the resources to forge a self amid the absurdity of their condition. Those resources were African. And the scholarly work aimed to demonstrate this connection and continuity. And it didn't have to be in the Herzkovitzian model, right? Many people wanted to just simply turn to Africa. If you read Michael Sobel's work, for example, on Black Baptists, right? You see this initial journey to Africa as a way of locating a particular kind of Weltanschauung and a particular kind of worldview as to how folk ought to understand the uniqueness of black religiosity, right? Part of what we have to see, part of what we see in this moment, right, is there's a way in which we could think about these people as not being simply reducible to the hell that they're catching in slavery, that they're not just simply extensions of the master's will. Well, how do we account for that? But we want to trace them beyond this institution, and the way we do that is to Africa, is to turn to Africa. I point your attention to this work, not to belittle it or to call its scholarship into question, far from it. I only want to highlight the way Africa has been imploded in the story in light of a broader context within which histories of African American religion have been written, histories in which certain motifs, characters, plots, and settings orient the reader and locate her in a particular terrain and social space. There's a wonderful, I'm thinking about the context of these brief reflections is really kind of my working through, and I talked with Ron about this earlier, a kind of pragmatic understanding of history, really thinking about the relationship between, say, Emerson's essays on history and representative men, and how we can think about history as biography without falling into Emerson's subjectivism, right? And so how do we begin to think about writing history, a pragmatic history, right, with knowledge of the present informs our understanding of the past, right? And so it's a kind of presentist preoccupation that drives the organization, right, of the facts as we begin to lay bare particular problems that are confronting us right here, right now. And I want to suggest that the ways in which Africa has been deployed is precisely in this manner, right? That is to say, it's always already in the service of a certain kind of political project, even as some folk are actually engaged in excavating, right, continuities, right? Those continuities are doing certain kinds of political work. Because remember I said, following Bois, there's that name again, that all religious history, right, is in some substantive way political history, right? And all political history is in some significant way religious history. That's the Lord calling me. Right. I knew it. To be sure, African American religious historians have relied on certain motifs to tell their story of African American religion. I think I've been beating this point home. And I can give some examples. Stories of declension, so central to American religious history in general, take on a different form in African American religious historiography. You know, fall from a glorious African past, or the story of the prophetic black church of the 19th century, which falls short in light of the interwar period and the emergence of all of these cults and sects and the like. And of course, black theologians riding in on their black horses to save the day, not white horses, black horses. Or you can think about stories of religion and freedom that begin with the presence of Africa, differentiating, say, African American appropriations of Christianity. And like I've been asking, what sort of work is Africa doing in certain accounts of African American religion? Or we can think about this notion of recovery and redemption, which aims to shed light on the darkness of the continent, to proclaim the gift, Pache Hegel, of its descendants to the world, right? More often than not, these stories, these plot lines, right, are framed within a liberatory or progressive model. Even narratives of declension stand as a prelude to liberation, right? I've tried to show that uses of the trope of Africa are central to such efforts. I'm coming to a close so we can talk. Indeed, beginning the story of African American religion with the question of African origins orients the narrative in a particular sort of way. The result has been an affirmation of a certain kind of black subjectivity, and too often, in my view, an evasion of the particulars of the vast continent and the complexities of its relationship to the New World. In other words, Africa, in the service of a particular story of recovery, redemption, and resistance, often obscures more than it illuminates. It blinds us to the fact that, quote, Africa is neither a figment of a New World imagination, frozen in time, nor the sole birthplace of modern African culture, end quote. Instead, the actual doings and sufferings of African-descended peoples constantly reshape, recast, and transform Africa and its diaspora. The stories I've alluded to mattered and continue to matter. But we can and must insist on a different beginning. And here I'm trying to speak to the theme of the colloquium. In part because these older stories make it possible to begin anew. Africa, quote unquote, can now be approached without the justificatory burden of black agency and the weight of resistance. We can take up the extraordinary richness and diversity of its landscape, not simply to establish continuity and connections, but to explore the beliefs held, the choices made, and the actions taken in the context of an ever-changing world. Now, we've certainly seen some good work, some great work in this regard. I'm thinking about the tremendous scholarship of John Thornton and Michael Gomez, the work of David Eltis and David Richardson, and the ongoing work around the African American religion, a documentary history project. We hope that that will be finished at some point. As well as the work in and around the Black Atlantic that is not so caught within national histories. In fact, that work seems to disrupt such accounts, right? We can now see much more of the complexity of the relationship of African ethnic enclaves to their New World destinations and see somewhat more clearly their cultural effects. But even someone like Thornton and Gomez, for example, ironically fall into some traps. As Philip Morgan has argued, they tend to overreach their evidence and claim a cohesive and coherent African identity for many slaves that, in his view, and I would agree, downplay cultural creation, adjustment, and adaptation that characterize the efforts of diverse Africans on this side of the Atlantic. One might wonder if the question of Black agency has been recast even in this context. Now, my primary purpose tonight has been to call attention to how our beginning of the story of African American religion shapes the history of the study of African American religion. To my mind, there is much more to the story of African American religion than the issues of resistance and agency, even as we want to maintain the importance of those tropes. Important concerns though they may be, neither exhaust the myriad narrative possibilities evidenced in the extraordinary religious imaginations of these New World peoples. To begin the story differently, I'm quite confident to say, will return us to that mess with which I began this talk. And like the artist to whom Beckett refers, and like those scholars who have come before us, we too must find a form to accommodate it. Thank you. So, do I sit down or?
No, you stay here.
Here's the ritual, the feast.
Terrence, do we have a microphone for questioners, or will we just, anyway, we have ample time for questions. Why don't I let you recognize people, and
Thank you.
when I think we're worn out, I'll bring it to an end.
Sure.
Okay. Mike's here. People wanna...
Good. We can all go home.
No, you already got it.
Oh. How you doing? I'm holding on.
Is this working? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I came a little late. But I was wondering if you talked about Du Bois and saying that our stories should start in Africa. But I read some writings by yourself and Solars some years ago that talked about the reconfigured Exodus saga and the 400-year situation, after which, there's some divine dispensation.
Right.
And I find that, I'm a Muslim myself, but I grew up in the church and I still attend church. And I find that at the African American church, the Exodus saga is continually brought up again and as a kind of African American version of American exceptionalism. And I was wondering if you could speak on that.
Yes.
Yeah. Go right ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to. I want to make the claim that. And let me back up a little bit. In reading Professor Ravito's Slave Religion, there's a wonderful chapter, Catechesis and Conversion. Remember that chapter? And there's this interesting moment in that chapter where Al kind of reflects on this moment, this gap, right? And the gap has everything to do with, right, the gap between the intention of that which is uttered, right, alongside of the kind of the performative contradiction of those who are committed to certain claims. And what do I mean by that? That is to say, there are these folk who are trying to convert Christians, right, or convert slaves to Christianity, right? And so their intention is to convert them in this way, right? And there's a gap between their intention to convert them such that they could become better slaves and what the slave actually hears. And then that gap is widened, right, by the performative contradiction, right? You know, there's this example that Rabbitoh uses of the South Carolina slaveholder saying to the slave as he submits to baptism, do you submit to baptism because you want to be a true Christian, or do you submit to baptism because you want to be free, or something like that, right? So there's this performative contradiction. And what Rabbitoh says is that if the slaveholder, right, assumes that the slave who converts to Christianity is not going to simply or merely parrot the doctrine, that they have to imbibe it, they have to absorb it, then at that moment they can't control its meaning, right? And for Rabbitoh, this movement from instruction to conversion is the opening for the sorts of creativity, right? The sorts of creation, cultural adaptation that generates this outcome called black Christianity, right? For Rabbitoh, African American Christianity is a refutation of the idolatry of white Christianity. Does that make sense? Okay, right? And so for Rabbitoh, and then how then might we chart this kind of cultural creativity, right? This forging of a theology that is unique and rooted in, not necessarily totally distinct, but rooted in the particular conditions of these folk who are caught under the conditions of slavery, right? So for him, right, because remember, this chapter comes on the heels of his own attempt to try to find a middle way between the Herskovits-Fraser debate, right? So it's not just simply about these folk just simply bringing tools. Baptism is not just simply water rituals, right? Something else is going on here, right? And so for him, Exodus, the interpretation of Exodus, because that's how he ends slave religion, right, is with the reading of Exodus, and that's how he begins. That's the first essay in Fire in the Bones, of how these folk interpret the Exodus story. Now, I tend to read that as a way in which we can begin to think about their implication in a certain kind of American nationalism, at the same time how they themselves imagine themselves as a kind of people, how they can imagine a notion of racial solidarity without falling into the traps of racial essentialism. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is Du Bois's account. Du Bois's account is really fascinating to me, and Curtis Evans has written a wonderful piece on Du Bois and the study of religion. I think it came out a couple of issues back in the Journal of American Academy of Religion, where he's really trying to figure out all of the insights and contradictions that follow Du Bois's account of African American religion. And part of what I want to suggest is that Du Bois's account frames in these very interesting ways some of the questions that we're preoccupied with. And one move that he makes early on, right? This essay was initially published in 1900, comes out in 1903, but we see he actually reflects on the black church early on in the late 1890s, right, at a convention where he talks about this institution having to change in the face of the differentiation of the black community. But Du Bois says, though, that we have to begin to think about African American religiosity as not being reducible to the American context of slavery. And so how does he make that claim? How does he substantiate that claim? We have to go prior to that moment. Now, perhaps that's right? That might be right. I'm not sure. I just want to think about the political motivation behind the move, right? Because we see it, say, for example, in Afrocentric writing, right? There's a way in which we can account for ourselves apart from the gaze of white folks. And this becomes an interesting and important way for accounting for a certain conception of black subjectivity that's not reducible to New World circumstances. Now, why is that so important? It's the question I want to ask, right? Another example of Du Bois shaping the study of African American religion is not only the otherworldly, this worldly distinction. There's a moment in Of the Faith of Our Fathers where Du Bois sees, he says at the end, and I talked about this last time I was here, he says that he sees the black church differentiating, right? Moving into these churches that are that aren't distinguishable from broad white churches, or churches that are become big businesses. Right? That do, I mean, he actually notes at the end of that chapter, right, a complex religious landscape, but at the very moment in which he notes something that might look like prosperity gospel, he represses it. he moves it out of the way as not being authentically an authentic expression of African American religion. Perhaps that's what he's saying. I'm not sure. Right? And the result has been that we haven't told ourselves a thick enough story about African American religious expression that would include resources that would account for some of the stuff we see today. And so folk are walking around saying, see, that's new, that's new, that's new. And when in fact it's not. It's not. Somebody should put on the cover, two people back to back, Reverend Ike and Martin Luther King. And then right underneath, who won? Right? And we can go from Reverend Ike to Prophet Jones. We can begin to tell a thicker story about African American religiosity. And I think part of what happens is that Du Bois's account frames so much of what we do. And part of what I'm trying to do, because it's edible in some way. I'm just trying to figure out my relationship to this cat. Maybe I have self-aggrandized. Yes, and then we got to come.
Okay, I had a question about the thickness also. If you could comment on this aspect of the thickness. I thought it was a fabulous talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I thought what was thin for me was it sort of flattened the internal contestations that African Americans are having about Africanness, which I think occurs around the time of the American Colonization Society, for example, early 1800s, where they're seeing Africanness as a trap that might justify white Americans as seeing them as somehow foreign and justifying extricating them, free blacks, and moving them somewhere else so that they can better control enslaved blacks. And this has come up again topically with Barack Obama's church, right? So it's an Afrocentric church, and on the website it says, we are an African people, and some people are questioning whether or not that indicates that Barack is, or that church is somehow anti-American and unpatriotic.
Right. That's a great question. On so many different levels. Part of what the first move I want to make is to make a distinction between the writing of history, right? The sorts of preoccupations that organize the very ways in which we implot the details, right? And then the actual this is only an analytic distinction, and then the messiness that's on the ground. So part of what I'm trying to do is to kind of chart. In some ways, some people say that what I do is a kind of intellectual history of African American religious thought, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is to think about a certain kind of problematic within the ways in which we've written the history about these folk. And that's not to deny the complexity on the ground, because some folk have actually done exactly the work that you're suggesting, particularly around, debates around colored, right, and African Methodist Episcopal, using African as a way to describe the AME church. How we ought to call ourselves colored. How does that moment at a particular point in the early 19th century signal a certain kind of political consciousness vis-a-vis the identification with Africa? How that then is played out within a range of debates around immigration with an E. I'm from Mississippi, I can't make the distinction, right? So these sorts of things, right? So all of this is, folks have done some really interesting work on the ground. But what's interesting for me is that at a certain level of the problematic of writing a particular kind of history about the religiosity of folk, right? There's a certain way in which when we begin to talk about, well, how do we account for, beyond the particulars, right, their religious orientation, right? A lot of folk have kind of made their, and I'm thinking here of people like Gaylord Wilmore, people like Michael Sobel and some others. We begin to see this turn to that direction, and I want to trouble that a bit. So I'm conceding the claim, but I want to also say I'm talking about it at a different level as well. So yeah, Sister. Can I concede that claim? I think I can. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful, and I have some thoughts on this idea of historicizing the history of this, because, it's interesting that the questions that we ask of the past are always the questions of our own time. And so when Al Raboteau is writing, he is very much addressing the Herskovits issue. In fact, remember when he first starts it off, he even identifies all the myths of the Negro past. But I think we're really in a very new moment now, and this new moment is best represented by my colleague, Loranda Mattori. He's written a brilliant book, Black Religions of the Atlantic. I think I have that title right. And what he's arguing in that book is that, and he's an anthropologist, is that we have for so long understood Africa as this kind of stable, tradition. And so we are looking back for our roots, but that those roots, and he'll play with it with R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S. And what happens is that not only is the American scene constantly changing and differentiated. You've got Candomblé, and you've got Obia, and you just got all these things going on the Americas, in the Americas. But Africa itself is changing, and not only is it changing, but it's changing because of the Americas.
Absolutely.
That Africa is getting these new voices, these new American ideas of people who are literally in the New World, in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, who go back to Africa and change African religions. And so there's such a big blend. And for me, what I find so fascinating is that he is probably the most recent, and I think one of the ablest discussants in this long-standing Herskovits debate.
Right.
I don't believe that book would be possible if we didn't live at a time when we have such a dispersion of people, the immigration with the I. I mean, there are more Africans moving to the Americas and to outside of Africa than there was in the slave trade era. There is such a dispersion, and there's such a movement back and forth, that I think our present is determining our history. We are looking now with just brand new questions. And I think the way we will look at African American religious history will never draw on, well, I shouldn't say never, but its gaze is somewhere else. It's not back in the traditional Herskovits understanding of finding the survival in the same kind of way.
Right. I think that's right, and that was a very gentle way of saying. I think that's right. And what I'm trying to suggest is not so. I don't want to rehash old debates in the sense that I don't want to say that Herskovits's legacy still looms large.
No, I think what I'm trying to say is that I'm vindicating your
okay, because I was thinking, wow, it's already done.
Your argument,
okay.
No,
Okay.
I liked your argument, because what
Okay.
your argument is saying to us is that there is a politics of history, and that there is a history that is understood by, you were saying it to the question back there, the circumstances and the issues of this time.
Right.
And what I'm so as I heard that genealogy, what I'm saying is that there's a new one.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when you think about what Liz McAllister has done with her work, thinking about religioscapes and particularly Haitian migrants to New York City,
It's amazing.
and how we look at just simply migratory patterns, and we think about them economically, but we need to think about how they create these streams or these conduits for different religious meanings to circulate within the diaspora. I think that's really crucial. But what's interesting is where we haven't really begun to see an expansive body of scholarship in this regard. It's just beginning. And part of what I'm trying to do is to kind of open up some kind of theoretical reflection. How do we tell ourselves a story about how we've gotten to this point, right? I think it's like we don't, for example, we don't have a vast body of literature or research on African American quote-unquote fundamentalism. And we have to tell ourselves a story as to why we haven't told ourselves a story about this. Or we don't have a really expansive body of literature on African American Pentecostalism. And we have to tell ourselves a story about why that's the case. And it has something to do with, interestingly enough, right, these preoccupations that have defined the very ways in which we've written our story, or the ways in which African American religious history has been told. One way of accounting for it has been that a certain kind of liberal Protestant sensibility has informed the writing of the story. So you just think about all of those master's theses written at Chicago, right? And then you think about Benny Mays and Nicholson, right? And then you think about E. Franklin Frazier. And then we look at all the footnotes in the 70s, and we see them all citing all of those Chicago theses, right? And then what we see here is the kind of reproduction of a certain kind of regime of truth about how we understand the production of religious meaning within this particular community. And part of what the moment we're in, and I think, Evelyn, you've hit it right on, and Randy's work is so good in this regard. It's part of what we're in a moment where, and I get in trouble saying this in other places, where many of the categories that were fought, that people fought to be able to use, are now being subject to critical scrutiny. Does that make sense? So, for example, you can think about in Africana philosophy, right? When you think about a group of African American philosophers whose principal preoccupation was to think about race and freedom. Right? I'm repressing the guy who writes on Alain Locke.
Jeffrey Stewart?
No, just repressing my name. He's at Purdue.
Yeah,
Leonard
Harris.
Leonard Harris, thank you. Philosophy Born of Struggle, right? So there was a big conference. I had to pull it up. I had to download it. Philosophy Born of Struggle. It was a big conference, you know, and that's all they used to do. Angela Davis, Cornell, Bill Lawson, Howard McGarry, Leonard Harris, all these cats, they know each other. They give each other pounds. They drink cognac together because they used to get together and, you know, and they used to think about freedom and race, right? Think hard. And then, you know, Anthony writes his essay where he begins to call into question the very category that had been assumed to be stable. And so here we are in African American religious studies, and I'm going to say this and get in trouble, because Al and a host of the folks, and you too, not that you're in Al's generation, but because you're not in Al's generation. No, you're not. That voice emerges, and Al's complicating a lot of things, and you were complicating a lot of things. But it emerges at the same time that the Black liberation theology voice emerges, right? And then we know that there's an ideological battle between Black liberation theology and African American religious historians. And we know who lost, right? And we know who lost. And that's all we got to do is just go into any library file and just type in African American religion and see what books show up. And what we begin to see is that the sorts of questions that animate the kinds of literatures that have been produced within the frame of Black liberation theology, certain sorts of questions preoccupy them. Questions that don't end up in the lap of Randy Mattori, but actually end up in someone else's lap. But that's a long-winded answer. Thank you. At first, I thought you were giving me the slight, oh, this is old hat. I thought you could. It was all gentle. Yes?
Hi, I wonder if you could say a little bit or reflect a bit on the potential ramifications of this for broader issues that are dealt with in the colloquium that is under which invited you, about the questions of race and religion. Because the obsession with origin, because I think they're potentially very large, the obsession with origin has been pointed out to be endemic to the study of religion itself. Tomoku Masuzawa's book, Origins of the Dreamtime, where the study of religion begins with an obsession with origin, and although we no longer foreground those questions, they're percolating in the background. Or somewhat less impenetrably, Talal Asad says that there's no history of religion unless it comes on the back of a Protestant Enlightenment telos of a certain kind that begins with origin and moves toward progress endpoint. And so it seems to me that, that it seems a bit unfair almost to weigh the state of African American religious history right now, or the state of the field, to put it all at Du Bois's feet. It's endemic to a much larger, is Al Rabateau also at the same level that he's influenced by African American history, also by the way in which religion itself has been historically studied. So could you reflect a little bit on what you see the potential being for the broader study of religion and the history of religion?
Sure. Part of where I go back to where I began. I began with by noting or marking the incredibly difficult task that we as self-identified religionists engage in. That is to say that we find ourselves struggling with the term that we created to deal with these sorts of practices that are very, very complex and nuanced and subtle and contradictory in so many different ways. And part of what I'm trying to suggest, and let me say this by way of caveat, part of what I'm trying to do in locating Du Bois, locating it at the feet of Du Bois, is to just try to mark a particular obsession of my own and then to reflect on that obsession and to see what it generates. I'm perfectly open to other people saying, well, we can begin elsewhere. And because the point that I was making following Said is that the problem of beginning is the beginning of the problem. And if we extrapolate that broadly, part of what we have to do is to kind of engage in critical reflection on these competing stories. Right? That is to say that there are competing narratives that we tell ourselves about what we're doing, whether we're on the normative side in the philosophy of religion, whether we do Buddhism or Hinduism. There are these competing narratives about how do we account for particular intellectual problems that we're trying to wrap our minds around. Part of the implication, why am I hunching up? Part of the implication of the work is to say that this becomes a site of intellectual work, right? That is to say, what does it mean, right? It's not so much to say, right, that origins are really beginnings, right? I'm actually more interested in the subsequent question, that is to say, what motivates beginning here as opposed to there? And the moment we ask that question, right, we begin to get to something, I think, a little bit more central, right, about the various ways or various descriptions that work and circulate in our particular areas. And so part of what I'm suggesting here is that we understand the significance of questioning the political implications of beginnings, period. Does that make sense? And so that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And it has everything to do with my pragmatist commitments, right? It has everything to do with, it's not reducible to those commitments, but it has everything to do with my own obsession, right? My own obsession is how do I account for this moment right here, right now, where I'm engaged in this particular kind of work? Why am I so friggin' obsessed with these sorts of questions as opposed to this question? How can I begin to situate myself within a field that for on a number of different occasions can't quite make sense of why I'm obsessed with this in this way? And so part of what I'm trying to do is to tell a story from the vantage point of where I am now about how I got here. And in the process of that kind of solipsistic or narcissistic kind of preoccupation, right, I'm telling a story about the field as such, right, about the field as such, and hopefully opening up new pathways for reflection at the same time.
Yes, I want to thank you for your amazingly stimulating discussion tonight. And I want to thank you for not jumping to a particular answer, but simply sharpening the question. I also would like to ask you, I want to reflect upon a question that you raised about why Pentecostalism, for example, has not been given its rightful place in the history of development. Could it be that there was a time in the history of black churches when all forms of religious expression were present, were tolerated, were understood, and that ranged from those who sit silent in worship, and there will always be the chosen frozen, and so you're going to always have silent people. Not all black people are going to be as expressive as others.
Right.
On the other hand, you're going to have persons who are off the hook expressive. And I believe there was a time in our history, like in the time of Roman Catholic history, when everything Christian could be tolerated under that one shelter. And then they began to separate out or get kicked out, where you had variation. In our history, there was a time when the shouters and the thinkers were able to worship together, and the shouters not prevent the thinkers from thinking, and the thinkers not prevent the shouters from shouting. And they all were able to get along together. Then the churches became so-called more respectable. They went to a higher level, and they began to mimic the values of the wider society, white society, and then you couldn't have these people speaking in tongues and getting out in the middle of the floor and dancing and rolling over whatever they were doing. Because you were a middle-class church now. You were an acceptable church, and so you had to separate those people out. And I noticed my church is split right down the middle. Those who are more expressive sit to the left of the pulpit. Those that are quieter sit over there. And there's less toleration for variation than there used to be. And I think that happens when churches reach a certain sociological. I just want you to comment on that.
Well, there's certainly a story that we can tell about the routinization of charisma. There's certainly a story that we can tell about the kind of mainstreaming of particular forms of religious expression. One can imagine not just simply African Americans, but one can imagine at one point white Methodists and white Baptists acting a particular sort of way because they were marginal religious voices. In fact, they could act in such a way that they could condemn slavery and then find themselves absorbed or mainstreamed, and suddenly slavery becomes more tolerable. I don't know if I'm as convinced as you are that there was a time when all of us could worship under in one space in our various ways. I'm more inclined to presume differentiation all the way down, that there's always been kind of distinctions, and those distinctions play themselves out in different registers under different historical and material conditions. So on the one hand, I want to grant your claim that we need to think about what happens when a particular religious denomination acquires a certain kind of status within a certain set of social arrangements, and how that status then impacts the worship. And so we get certain kinds of distinctions between high church and other forms of worship. Frozen church, the frozen chosen, as it were. But I don't know if that quite accounts for the blindness or the absence of historical accounts of Pentecostalism. I think, interestingly enough, Pentecostalism in the historical literature emerges at the same time that people are talking about the black Jews, that they're talking about the sects and cults. And so Pentecostalism is often in the literature initially accounted for as a foreign, as other, as a site where folk have gone off and embraced something wholly strange. And that initial entree into the scholarly literature, right, had an impact, I think, on the ways in which we've studied Pentecostalism up to. We're just now beginning to get some work. I'm repressing her name. She's at Rochester. Her recent book, Anthea Butler. There you go. I'm repressing a lot. Anthea's recent book on Pentecostalism is wonderful in this regard. And one of your students wrote a wonderful, she was writing a dissertation, I recall, on Pentecostalism. I can't. Yeah, because that Nell student, right? So so we're just now beginning to get sophisticated work around this in this regard. So I want to resist the narrative that once when, and now blah, right? I want to resist that, because part of what I think we have to wrap our minds around is that, we're complicated folk. Complicated folk on so many different levels. On so many different levels. I can't threaten to fail you now.
Love the lecture. Love the lecture.
I really had to. He wrote his senior thesis with me. I'm so proud. Yeah, go ahead.
The question is not about black paganism, nor is
good.
Nor is it about internationalism, although I'll bracket that for another time.
Okay.
But what I'm really interested in, and you sort of alluded to this in the beginning of the talk, so there's a questioning here of the centrality of Africa. What is Africa and African American religion? What I would like to ask about is, are we willing to question the black, or the African American, the whole term, in African American religion. So,
Yeah.
so we can jettison the originary piece of Africa.
Right.
But as we sort of turn to the messiness and the
Absolutely.
hybridity within America and within perhaps the diaspora,
Right.
is there room for talking about something that is bigger than just about what's about black people?
Yeah, that's a naughty question.
It is a naughty question.
But I think you're right. I'm working on, at least I'm supposed to be working on, that Oxford series, the very short introductions on African American religion, and this is the question that I begin the book with, or that which will become a book, or that which will become the writing that will become the book.
When did you say
A while back, yes. And it becomes, we don't walk around talking about Black Buddhists, Black Buddhism,
We don't.
or Black Hinduism, right? So part of what I want to do is to think about what is this I began with those broad questions, right? What does it mean to think about these words together, religion and African American? How might the adjective Black or African American overdetermine the noun? Is it just simply signaling a particular political and historical reality? Are we talking about something uniquely different, right? And it's a question that we have to wrap our minds around. What, in fact, might the label single out, right? Now, when it comes to African American Christianity, it becomes for me, a somewhat interesting and perhaps easier answer that's ready at hand. I'm not quite sure why yet. But it is a question that we have to kind of ponder, right? And so are we talking about a particular history of religious practice, right? And, well, how does that history then lead us to say, because usually when we talk about a Black Hinduist, right, or a Black Buddhist, we're just talking about a Buddhist who happens to be Black. But when we talk about an African American Christian, right, that phrase carries a little bit more weight to it. And we have to think about why that's the case, right? And it might be historical, it might be political, it might be sociological, but we have to think about it. And so I can't answer that now. That's why I kind of paused and mentioned it as a frame and left it. But it is something that has to be an object of inquiry, has to be subject to serious reflection. And part of it has to do with, as the kind of person that I am, is thinking about what are the effects of these labels? How do these labels carry us forth in experience, right? And so as we begin to think about the complex landscape of African American religious practitioners, what do these labels do in helping us sort through the messiness of the landscape that we encounter? Do they block the way to further clarity, or do they open up the way in certain instances? My intuitions right now rest here, that the labels actually matter, that when we use words like Black Muslim, it signals something particular, and we can tell a story about its evolution, its development. Yes?
I believe it gets you back to Africa, because the Black Muslims, the Black Jews, the Black Christians.
Oh, that's really
all
wonderful.
back there in
That's how
Africa.
the trope kind of re-enters, but in a different way. Okay,
Black
I see what you're
Buddhists,
saying.
that's in Asia. All the rest of them. No, you got the Black Jews as far back as, the Queen of Sheba in Ethiopia, and you got the Black Muslims, because in the ancient African days, you had Islamic cultures. In the 16th century in Congo, you had Catholicism.
But would you call it Black Catholicism?
No, I think they called it, I'm not sure what the king of Congo called it, but it was clearly Catholicism, and they sent people to Portugal,
Right.
and they, mixed those images, the cross, that ivory, how does it go? That the cross
Right, right. I
It's
know
actually
exactly
a
what
symbol
you're
in Kikongo.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so, but anyway, but there is a reality. It's your argument. It's a reality that's there. Black people haven't taken, all those black forms of religion are still, have a root somewhere in Africa.
That's one way of doing it. One could say, one could reintroduce the trope of Africa in a different way, right? That is to say that there are these kind of, well, no, that wouldn't work. But there,
Can I say one more thing?
because
I'm sorry.
No, go
to be
ahead.
So I just love talking to you. But you know, we have this long history in the black church. You know, the great Kush and all that. I mean, all that's even in the black Christian tradition.
Oh,
Where we're
absolutely.
just hearkening back to our
Absolutely.
religious roots in Africa.
But what I'm hesitant about, Evelyn, is using that as a kind of a sufficient condition for identifying what is an expression of black religion, right? I know, and if I would have conceded, it would have been a performative contradiction. But what I'm thinking about here is that it doesn't quite get us to really being able to wrap our minds around what is a very messy religious landscape where there's all of this overlap and interpenetration, right? Pocomania in Jamaica, is that black religion? Candomblé, is it black religion? If so, why? What political work is that doing? And so part of what I want to do in the beginning of this, of this writing that would become the book, if it ever is written, is to kind of use this as a moment to do the kind of querying and work that Ernie is talking about and what you just kind of began. So that was me petering out in the face of that. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
That was great.
This ties into a conversation I was actually having with Ernie the other day while we were watching the political returns, and it's somewhat of a political question.
Okay,
But
excellent.
we were talking about Du Bois and the question of, you know, why is this the narrative that we seem to be running with? And the question I'm asking is that with black academics in the study of religion, is there a need to have to sell black religion and black history as something, a tragic narrative, but with these, you know, self-determination elements in them? So even with black theology, you have this notion that we have been removed from our homeland, but there is this subversive element within our tradition that, you know, allows us to keep striving for what is essentially fits into the American dream. So there's an element of tragedy for me, but there's also this element that, you know, they are nobly working towards the goals that we have as a country. And my question for you is, do you think that there's that word progress, there's enough progress for you, you know, not to have to sell that type of black religion in scholarship to people?
Yeah, I get hit with this question. I get hit with the version of this question all the time, right? Last time, I think I was telling you, Ron, about I was in Alabama and I gave a version of this talk, and this cat just stood up and he had a PhD, but he forgot that he had one. And he said, "What the hell make you think we're ready to be so attentive to complexity and nuance?" Too many people catching hell, right? There's, you know, these stories are doing political work, and what authorizes you or justifies your conclusion that we no longer need that kind of political work to be done? Is this a version of the question that you're asking?
It's, in a sense, I just wanted to see if you thought that, you know, there is enough room for you to have the freedom to go back and reassess those complexities of religion that are without a doubt there.
I think so, and part of it has to do with a political motivation, to be honest with you. And it's a political motivation that that proceeds from this assumption, right? That is, that the moment that we happen to be in requires a set of descriptions that are descriptions that are apt, that account for the complexity and nuance of the moment, precisely because that complexity and nuance continuously frustrates our political aims and ambitions. You see the move? So there are people who are articulating a politics predicated upon a narrative about black folk, right? And that narrative, right, doesn't quite, it's always in some interesting sorts of ways, in my view, undermining the political ambitions that, to which the appeal to the narratives, that motivate the appeal to the narrative in the first place. Does that make sense? And so part of it, like for example, there's this desire to understand the African-American religious landscape. You know, and it's a perennial preoccupation. What is the role of the black church today? If you want to know where black people are, let's look to the black church, right? How black people are doing, let's look to the black church. Is the black church still relevant? Let's answer that question. I keep looking at you, I'm sorry, right? Right? But it's a perennial preoccupation, right? And that perennial preoccupation has something to do with the particular understanding of black life, in which the black church is at the center, in which this particular religious institution is at the center. What if we begin to tell a different story about that institution and about black life as such, right? Maybe that question is not as pressing as it once was. We've had this discussion before, right? And in addition, I do believe that these post-soul babies, right? Those of us born in the aftermath of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, right? We have to wrap our minds around the implications of the successes and failures of that movement and what it has opened up and what it has constrained at the same time. And part of that analysis will require, in interesting sorts of ways, in my view, an attention to complexity and nuance, precisely because our politics, to go back to where I began, are continuously running up against a brick wall in the face of that complexity, because we're trying to mobilize communities with the presumption of black solidarity. We're trying to mobilize churches with the presumption that they're necessarily prophetic. We're trying to mobilize, right, communities with the presumption that they're necessarily have certain kinds of political interests that are singular. And all the time we're finding out, well, why isn't it working, right, on the ground, right? And this is what makes Obama dangerous and delightful at the same time, because all of this is at play in his campaign. Oh, the dean. Gotta ask the dean. Yes. The dean, yes, sir.
Let me start with something very, very simple, which is about the level I operate on. And that is, I want to ask you just to say a little bit more about the issue of the political in relation to your comments about origins and beginnings. Now let me complexify that or explain that a little bit. If you look at, as I do, at Islamic history, and if you look at the interpretation of Islam by Jews and Christians in particular, and by Western secularists, across the 19th and most of the 20th century. When you talk about origins, it's been politically used in scholarship, and this is, this would be parallel to a lot of Said's perceptions, but on a very different track. It's been used a lot to, in a way, disqualify Islamic religiousness as anything original.
Right.
Because and of course the Christians first did it with the Jews to begin. I mean, Paul starts this. I mean, this goes
right.
a long way back.
Right.
But then the Jews and the Christians, beginning in the 1820s or 30s at least, start doing this with the interpretation of Islam. Islam can be explained away because its origins are obviously in Judaism and Christianity.
Right.
And that's all part of this that Anne referred to, part of this originology that has bedeviled the study of religion much more broadly. You could talk about the same thing in the Indian case, you could talk the same thing in Buddhism. In Western study, in modern academic study of these traditions, this has been, I think, a scholarly political move to focus on origins and say we explain everything by going back to the origins.
Right.
How do you see that now playing out in either the reappropriation of African origins for African Americanism, and which is, I mean, I understand it's what you're talking about, but I wish you would maybe even think forward a little bit. What are the political dangers and possibilities in that, in the distinction you're trying to make between, and maybe I'm not understanding that distinction, between an origin not really being enough, but choosing which beginning you're going to start with. I mean, I like that because I think what you're getting at is maybe this same kind of thing of not being dominated by the origins. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I mean, part of what I want to do is to make explicit, right, the political stakes at the heart of these sorts of narratives that we tell, right? And that is to say that these become, that where we begin constitute, right, extraordinary sites of contestation, right, that the stakes are high, right, because we begin in this way as opposed to that for certain purposes and certain interests, right? And so it's to make explicit the very political work that certain stories that are naturalized are doing, right? I mean, this is rather old now, right? But the whole idea is to kind of understand what theologized knowledge is doing, right? In terms of reproducing meanings that, interestingly enough, coerce and discipline, right? And so part of what I want to do, and particularly in the context of African American religious studies, right, is to think about how thinking out loud about where we begin the story opens up space for different pathways, for different kinds of accounts that in my own kind of president's preoccupation, right, may redound in sorts of descriptions that open up different kinds of political possibilities in our current moment. And I say that precisely because as a person, I mean, it could be the case that as a kind of a person with philosophical leanings that I shouldn't give any attention to history altogether. I should just think about these problems in the abstract. But I don't hold that view, right? I think stories matter. Stories matter because the stories single out, right, certain issues that tend to preoccupy us, right? And so the kinds of stories we tell ourselves, right, if we tell bad stories, we oftentimes wind up being bad people. But the kinds of stories we tell ourselves matter in terms of the kinds of actions and choices we take, or we make, actions we take and the choices we make. And so part of what I'm suggesting, you answered it already in some significant way, is to make explicit the political work. And Said was notorious for this, right, in his own way. And I think it's very clear that Said has some political interest at heart in what he was doing. And it's important to understand that. When we read his book on Islam, we need to understand what he's doing. When we read Orientalism or culture and imperialism, we need to understand that there's some stakes here. And this avoids, I think this helps us avoid the material just washing over us. Right? We can be a little bit more active in our engagement with this stuff, as opposed to letting the stories implot us, as opposed to us implotting the stories.
It's all too rare in the academy that a scholar has the courage to invite an audience into a project in progress, but invariably those are among the most stimulating moments in the university, and we had one tonight. Thank you to Eddie Gloss.
Every time Ann asks a question, and every time you raise your hand, I'm just going to run from you.